Hello! Today, we'll be showing you how to replace the motherboard in a Dell 11-inch Chromebook. Before you begin your replacement, you will need a few tools. An anti-static mat is recommended to prevent electrostatic discharge, which can damage electronic parts. A small, magnetic tip Phillips head screwdriver will be necessary for this replacement. You will need thermal paste during this replacement. A spudger will also come in handy during this replacement. You can use either plastic or metal, whichever you prefer. If you have tweezers, you may also want to have them handy, as they might be useful when dealing with small parts. The first step will be to remove the 7 bottom cover screws. Next, you will use your spudger to go around the perimeter of the bottom cover and carefully pry it away from the keyboard assembly. Now, you will disconnect the battery cable from the motherboard. Next, you will remove the 4 battery screws. Now you can remove the battery. The next step will be to disconnect the keyboard cable from the motherboard. Next, you will disconnect the trackpad cable from the motherboard. Now, you can disconnect the speaker cable from the motherboard. Next, you will disconnect the charging port cable from the motherboard. Next, you will disconnect the LCD cable from the motherboard. Now, disconnect the fan cable from the motherboard. Next, you will disconnect the 2 Wi-Fi antenna cables from the motherboard. Now, you can remove the 4 motherboard and fan screws. Next, you will loosen the 4 heatsink screws. Next, you will remove the fan. Next, you will remove the cable going from the daughter board to the motherboard from the daughter board. Next, you can peel up the daughter board to motherboard cable and remove the motherboard from the keyboard assembly. You can leave the daughter board to motherboard cable attached, as well as the loosened heatsink. Next, you can turn over the motherboard and disconnect the daughter board to motherboard cable from the motherboard. Now, you can remove the heatsink from the motherboard. The first step in the installation of your replacement motherboard will be to apply thermal paste to the CPU on the motherboard. Next, you will set the heatsink back into place on the motherboard. Next, you will reconnect the daughter board to motherboard cable back to the bottom of the motherboard. Now, you will set the motherboard back into place, complete with the heatsink and daughter board to motherboard cable. Next, you will reconnect the daughter board to motherboard cable to the daughter board. Next, you will set the fan back into place. Now, you will replace the 4 motherboard and fan screws. Next, you will tighten the 4 heatsink screws. Now, you can reconnect the keyboard cable to the motherboard. Now, reconnect the trackpad cable to the motherboard. Next, you will reconnect the speaker cable to the motherboard. Now, you can reconnect the charging port cable to the motherboard. Next, reconnect the LCD cable to the motherboard. Now, you can reconnect the fan cable to the motherboard. Next, reconnect the 2 Wi-Fi antenna cables to the motherboard. Now you can set the battery back into place and replace the 4 battery screws. Now, you can reconnect the battery cable. Next, you will snap the bottom cover back onto the keyboard assembly. The final step will be to replace the 7 bottom cover screws. You have now successfully replaced the motherboard in your Dell 11-inch Chromebook. Nice job!